My name is Terry. Today we are going to talk about using drum samples in your drum mix. Now, drum samples play an incredibly big part in modern drum sound, and we really wouldn't be able to achieve the clarity and depth that we do without using them. So we have a live drum track, and I'm going to go through step by step how I would use them inside of a mix alongside my natural drums. So let's get to it. Hopefully when you're going to record your drums, you are taking the time to get excellent sounding overheads. And if you're using rooms, to get excellent sounding rooms with no phase problems. And you're getting nice, good, usable high end, because that's the only way that replacing drums is going to benefit you. If your overheads sound bad and your rooms sound bad, the samples won't save you. And it'll just be like dead on obvious that you use drum samples. I actually hear it quite a bit on people's recordings that they show me. They just don't know what they're doing. But there's no other way to know than to just keep doing it, you know. But I can tell you right now, if you're not spending time to make sure the overheads sound absolutely perfect, and I mean everything else is good and in phase, then this isn't going to work. And really, you should be spending time on your close mics just as much, because, I mean, if you can use the original sound, it's always going to be more dynamic, always going to be better. And I generally don't replace toms, so I have to spend a lot of time getting my toms to sound the way I want them to in the room. I don't have to gate them as bad as you do with a snare drum. The reason why we would use a sample on a snare drum and a sample on a kick drum is because they just have a ton of hi-hat. Well, the snare has a ton of hi-hat and a ton of bass drum in it. It's right next to all the instruments, and you just have to gate the part of it, like just a little bit of it, and that's not good enough to turn up as loud, because you'll hear the gating. And I went over that in the other video. So watch the video for the inside-outside mixing, and check all that out. That's got the original mix that I did with no drum samples on it, and I didn't really edit anything too bad on that either. But this mix is where that was. Before I made this video, I just kind of played around with the samples just for time's sake, so I'm not doing that in the video. But it's probably, I spent maybe an hour tops getting the samples that I wanted and getting them where I wanted. But I also, if you look on here, I have the original kick and the original snare here, and I have the samples muted. So let's take a listen to those. This is the original mix. Let's listen to the original mix. I mean, it sounds pretty good. Let's solo this. This is the original kick. This is an Audix D6 inside of the kick drum, like halfway in, pointed upwards, and a little bit away from the beater. I think it sounds great. And then the real snare drum, this is a DW chrome over steel. Now you can tell that I already got some pretty good rejection with my Audix. I used an Audix i5 on this, and it doesn't have a ton, but it does have a lot of bass drum and the bell and stuff in there. I mean, if you do a pretty good job with that, you can get this stuff pretty loud. You just won't be able to get it as loud and in your face as you would if you use samples, not to mention samples just dynamically are perfect. So those are those. Now let's listen to our kick sample. Compare it to our kick. Obviously, for one, there's no bleed in there, so turning it up as loud as you want isn't going to bring in other problems. You know, it's not going to then turn up a weird sounding cymbal or something from a drum fill when you turn it up, you know. And let's do our first snare sample. I did two, and this is how I usually do this. I'll grab a couple samples, and one is just the top of a snare. The other one is the overhead. If the sample pack that you buy has this type of separation, like this one is Get Good Drums. I've used it quite a bit. I really love the sound of it. It's the original one from the Matt Halpern pack. I have the other ones. I just don't think they're as good as the first one. But this is a top snare off of the signature snare and the overhead mic of the snare. And the overhead mic has some really nice stuff in it. Let's listen to it. So there's no bleed, for one, right? And here's this is the top snare sound. I mean, it's not too much different than what I was using for a snare, right? And let's listen to the overhead snare. Great sounding. I mean, really. Together, blended. It's really just gets like a nice whack. I like that. And then for the second sample, I used a close by room of the same snare, the far room of the same snare, and some more of that overhead, and blended these together. I dig this. I dig this sound. Really love the sound of those. I'm just gonna make these a different color, and we'll mute them. So, with just the samples mixed in, let's listen. Now, let's just put the regular drums back in. I like those regular drums, but let's see what we can do to amplify them with our snare sample and bass drum sample. What do you say? I think that it sounds more full and snappy with the drum samples in it. And it gives us some options as far as if we want to get that snare just loud, or, you know, we're not going to be held back by what else is in there, you know. But having the real snare in here, it adds the dynamics of the person who hit that snare drum. Let's listen from the beginning. Now, something about and I watched this in another video from another mixer that I think is amazing. His name is Adam Nolly. He is I think, main engineer, we'll just say, and former bass player of Periphery. I noticed he was using snare drum room samples and not really laying into the reverb as hard as like a normal engineer would or mixer would. And by using the snare drum, because the snare drum's really what we want to have that room and stuff in. But unless you have a real room to get that in, reverbs can be a little unpredictable depending on what gets put into them. And it's an emulation of a room. It's what it is. It's never going to be like a real room. So adding in a snare drum sample that has the room that you recorded it in, and you can do this at your drum recordings too. You don't have to use someone else's sample. Remember that. If you set up mics before you do your session or after you do your session, have that drummer, open another session, whatever, label it drum samples for session. Have him hit the drums hard, a couple times, soft a couple times, softer a couple of times, so on and so forth. And then have that going on, and you can make samples out of those drum hits or one-shots. You don't even have to make them that. You could take and make it into an audio file, and then just everywhere that you wanted, you could replace each hit or put it alongside each one of your natural hits, and you could use the drum room from the place you recorded at and have a unique drum sample. I do that all the time. I am a big fan of it, because then you don't have to play around with reverb, buses, and all this other stuff. It's on a fader. It sounds real. It adds dimension. So let's listen to this drum room sample. With the snare. Other snare sample. And the real snare. There's a lot of bleed in this guy, huh? Okay. So let's listen to another part here. Adding in the real snare gives it... I like the way my snare drum sounds. I probably wouldn't get too crazy with the samples on this, honestly. And the kick... I think I like my regular kick, but this does add some really controlled low end that this doesn't have because it's a real kick drum, and it just makes it easier to work with. So we could even add just a little bit of, and like I said, if you want to see these kinds of settings, these are all in that video. This is the same that I use for every single snare that I bring in, and I adjust the amount maybe here and there, but a little bit of 5K, a little bit of 110, and I get pretty wild out there with the 12K. I think it adds some niceness. I got a little compressor on here. You can hear what that's doing. I'll turn it off. Just add some length to it. So there's that. But what if we wanted to get a little bit more reverb on here? You know what I mean? Let's see. Let's open up doodly doodly doo. Shizzle. This is a family program, no cussing. Well, let's just do the regular frickin' Pro Tools here. That's a bit much, but I kind of like it. Nah. There we go. I mean, that's the decay. let's see what that sounds like. And another thing you can do with these drum samples that, you know, people who don't or just starting out may not realize that you can do is you can exaggerate parts with these kinds of room samples. Say, for instance, there was like a stop to the song. I think there is, like where it goes ka. All right, imagine you wanted to make this last hit just, you know, stand out and get like really dramatic. You could automate this guy. We'll go in here. Let's write it. Right? You could, you know, now take your final song. There might be a drum break where it goes, it's like, you know, doing something like pop, and you want that whole thing to have that. Just throw the snare drum across the soundscape. You know, you could do this. Let's see what that did. You know. But that's just some examples, and I hope that you found this video helpful, and it gives you kind of a better idea of how you could use drum samples to enhance your already good sounding drums, and not just to use them as a cop-out because maybe you don't want to spend the time to learn how to do this properly, or you just don't have a very good drummer. I would go get a better drummer, or maybe you could, you know, at least get his stuff tuned right and in phase, you know. But, you know, this stuff's here. It's here because people have crappy drummers. Drummers are hard to find. In any case, I hope that was good. I love you all. You know, if you have any questions or comments about what was done here, or you feel like something wasn't explained well and you need more of an explanation, leave it down in the comments. Okay? Talk to you later.